So let's finish up this monochromatic eye painting that we started last week. It's a simple little black and white study using both paint and graphite. All of the preliminary stuff like the paint mixtures, the transfer, and painting the iris are within last week's video, so I'll have that one linked up above. So the first thing that we need to do here is start painting in this upper eyelid. As I mentioned in some other videos, the eye sits within the orbit just below the frontal bone, and so it's recessed into the skull, so we're going to see some pretty dark shadows and cast shadows within here. I'm using the number 2 gray mixture that we mixed in last week's video, and you can see that I'm just using a few shields here. I'm just lining them up with that crease and then just spraying a small amount of paint below, trying to get an even curve across. This is going to need to be much darker later on, but just remember that it's always best to start light. If the value isn't too dark, it's just much easier to erase or remove if there's any mistakes. My goal here is just to get the outlines and some basic shading of this crease painted in. I'm not looking to paint the whole thing yet. We'll get to that later. This is just going to be my guide. And now from here, what I want to start doing is painting in the tear duct. And the first thing I'm going to do is paint in the outline or the contours of it. You can see on my completed painting that there's a pretty dark shadow at the top part of the tear duct. So I'm using my shields again with that number 2 gray mixture and just lightly spraying it over this area. The curve doesn't fit it perfectly, but that's okay. I could adjust it later on with the eraser. I'll use another part of this shield just to start painting in that next part of the transition between the sclera and the upper eyelid. You can see on the left side of the tear duct that that line goes up a little bit too high. It doesn't conform to that curve perfectly. So I could just use my eraser here and just erase it out, just clean it up. And this is what I meant by the shield not fitting perfectly. If it's a little bit off or you get some overspray in some directions that you don't want it, it's so easy to clean up with that eraser. So now at this point we have 2 transition points of that upper eyelid painted in. So what I'm going to start doing here is adding some value into it. So I'll start adding a little bit of paint toward that tear duct, and then I'll just use my shield to paint in that transition between the sclera and the upper eyelid. Now that we have that fully painted in, I'm just going to start lightly spraying this color onto the left side of that upper eyelid. Now in order to erase out some of these highlights, I'm going to be using a softer eraser here. This is one made by Faber-Castell. It's the 7056. You can tell the difference between this one and the 7058 because this one has a pink eraser in it where the 58 has a white harder eraser. And you can see that when I erase with this one, the highlight that I get is much softer than that other eraser, the 58. And I started using this eraser pretty recently. It doesn't remove that much paint, but you could do a very good job at adding in some soft transitions. If I want some of these highlights a little bit brighter and sharper, that's where I'm going to switch over to this eraser. You can see that the eraser inside here is white. This is a 7058B, and this one is an ink eraser. It's a lot more aggressive, so it just really helps me cut into that paint. And so at this point, I have my major transitions in place, so I can switch over to that darker gray mixture, the number 3 from last week's video, and I'll use it freehand here, and basically what I'm doing is just drawing with it. Where I see a darker value, a transition, I spray some more paint. And then like always, to pull out the brighter areas, I'm going right back over to my eraser, and you'll see me switching off between the two, the softer and the harder one. And this is definitely going to be a feel thing. I recommend just trying both of them out, seeing which one you like more. So once some of that upper eyelid is in place, I'll start working into the tear duct, and a lot of it is pretty soft here. So you'll see me using a fair amount of freehand here just to get in those transitions. I don't want them too sharp, but then when I want a sharper line like at the bottom of the tear duct, I'll use a freehand shield. For the first highlight within this eye, I'll be using an eraser here. This is an electric eraser called the Sumo Grip. And what I'm doing here is just like always, I'm using a negative or a subtractive technique to remove the paint. And of course, this exposes some of the white gesso underneath, so it makes the area lighter. And now it's very important to remember that there's a million different ways to go about painting. You don't have to use a negative or a subtractive technique. Art and art history is filled with all different styles, different techniques, and they're all available to use. And so if you're not a huge fan of the subtractive technique, you could use a positive one where you add the paint on top. You add an opaque color right on top where the highlight is. And of course you could do that with the airbrush, spray some white paint over the top, but that does introduce that blue shift where the colors kind of start to gray out, especially if it's over a portrait color, which is orange. And another way to do this is just by using a paintbrush. Just add some thicker white opaque paint right on top. And that's the way that oil painters have been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. For a very thin, bright, specular highlight like the one I'm adding in right now, I'm using an X-Acto blade and just cutting right into the paint. If you come from any drawing background or have used colored pencils, you're probably familiar with this technique, but you could just scratch out some very thin lines of pure white. But if you want to see some of the techniques of adding an opaque paint over the top of an airbrush painting, I'd like you to check out one of my personal favorite airbrush channels on YouTube. That's Rob's channel, DreadFX. Rob uses a very cool technique where he draws in his highlights with a small white paint pen. And because it's kind of like a paintbrush, it gives a very sharp line. But what he does is if he wants it a little bit smoother, he'll just kind of blend it with his finger. It's a very cool technique. He does it quickly and it's very, very effective. And I'm sure that most of you guys already know him because I've talked to a bunch of you guys about his channel. His videos are fun to watch. They always cheer me up. But above all else, his videos are educational. They get into different topics and all different tutorials related to airbrush painting. And so yeah, if you don't know his channel, it's definitely one you need to check out. I'll have a link for it down below. So now going back to this painting, to paint in the curve here on the corner of the tear duct, I'm using a small part of this shield. This is called the Big Shield by Art Tool. Over the last few months, I bought a bunch of different shields from Art Tool to replace some of my other ones, and I've been loving these. I'll definitely talk about them in some future videos. But you can see that I just lined that up with the left side of the tear duct. It's kind of like a small roundish shape, and just lightly sprayed it in to darken up that corner. And now what I want to do is create that separation between the tear duct and the sclera. So I started first by painting in this line freehand. It was just a little bit too soft, so I went over to a shield and then lightly sprayed over it. And you can see here that this transition line is just a little bit sloppy. It's a bit too dark as well. So I'll start with that pink eraser first and just lightly go over it to lighten it up. And then I'll move along to the harder eraser and just try to clean up the edges. And if you're just patient with that eraser and work slowly, you could really clean up things that get a little bit messy. I rely on it pretty much all the time. For the two small specular highlights in here, I'll use my electric eraser and just tap them in. And in my electric eraser, I'm using the same erasers that I've always used. It's the seed erasers. They're basically small sand erasers. They're kind of a grayish color, and they're much more aggressive than the softer white ones that usually come with an electric eraser. And so now I'm going to work into this tear duct with the eraser and just start drawing out some of the highlights. Some areas that are a bit too dark, I'll just kind of brush over to lighten them up. And then anything that looks a little bit too bright, I'll use the airbrush to lightly spray over them. I want to start adding some of this paint into the sclera. So again, using that number 2 gray mixture, I'm just lightly spraying it along the left side here. And what that does is just add a subtle gradient, a little bit darker on the left side of the sclera where the eye is rounding away. And then I just kept it lighter as I moved along to the iris so that area looks brighter and it looks like it's closer to us, like some light is hitting it. And then you'll see right here that I'm just lightly dusting on some of this gray paint right on that transition point between the iris and the sclera. I do want that part of the eye very bright, but I don't want it pure white. What I'm going to do from here is switch back over to that harder eraser, the 7058B, and I'll just work my way along this upper eyelid, just kind of scratching out a few of those thin bands of highlights that I'm seeing in the reference. I'll glaze some more of that number 2 gray mixture over the top, and then what I'm going to do here is switch over to that number 3 gray mixture and just go back to my shield to spray in some of that crease along the upper eyelid. You could even use the color black for this, but just remember to spray it lightly because it gets dark very, very quickly. The next thing to get in is these eyelashes, and what I'm going to be using for this is just a pencil. Basically, I'm just drawing them in, and the pencil I'm using here is a pretty soft one. This is a 4B. When you start using a really soft pencil like 4B all the way up to 8 or 9B, they're very dark. It almost looks like ink that you're drawing on. It of course is graphite, so you are going to get the control that you do get with the pencil. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just following that tracing that I have from last week's video and just drawing these in. And always paying attention to my reference, following what I see. After I get a few of these in, I'll switch back over to the eraser and the airbrush and just kind of adjust some of the values that I see around this. These eyelashes are so dark that it's going to make me see the painting a little bit differently. Some of the areas around it are going to look different than they did before, so I could adjust them as I see fit. And then right back over to the pencil to start drawing these in again. And I have to say that this is kind of a slow process. It looks like I'm doing this very quickly because the video is sped up, but trust me, like always, I was taking my time. Just go slow, don't rush, and you'll be able to draw on all of these eyelashes in probably about 10 minutes. But like I was saying before, there's a ton of ways to go about painting. I'm not recommending that you use a pencil here. That's just what I decided to do with this one. When I'm painting a little study like this, it's a practice piece. It's the best time in the world for me personally to experiment, try different techniques. I've used graphite pencil and acrylic airbrush paintings in the past, and it's always been a mixed media that I really enjoyed using. But the reason I'm saying this is that there's a bunch of other ways to add in these eyelashes. A very common technique that I love to use is to draw them in with a black colored pencil, or another great option is just paint them in with a paintbrush. And of course, you could also do it with the airbrush. You could paint them in freehand, but that's going to give you some softer edges. But if you want those edges a little bit sharper painting with the airbrush, you could use some sort of shield like Frisket film or some tape to add in each eyelash, spray them in so they're nice and sharp. Just understand that there's a ton of ways to go about painting, and it's always fun to explore and test out different techniques. I'm going back to my airbrush with that number 3 gray mixture, and what I'm doing here is spraying in the right side of the sclera. This way, as I darken up the right side of the eye, it's going to give the eye that 3D illusion, so it looks more like a sphere. It's bright in the center, making it look like it's closer, and then the edges are just a little bit darker, so it looks like they're rounding away. And I apologize, you can't even see my airbrush when I was doing this because I'm holding it pretty far back, about maybe 8 inches, 9 inches back. I noticed a few thin hairs along this upper eyelid that were just catching some light. They were in a highlight. So I'm using my X-Acto blade and just lightly scratching them out. They're very subtle. It's not something that I really needed to add, but I saw them there in my reference, so I just wanted to try to add a few of them in. And when adding a few hairs like this in, don't be scared to scratch them in right over the eye. That's how I see them in the reference, so that's what I'm going to do. I'll go back to a 4B pencil and draw in a few more of the eyelashes along the right side of this upper eyelid. And then once those are in, I'm going to go back to my airbrush, and this time I'm using the color black, a transparent color, just to spray in some of the shadows that I see. What I did for this color black is that I over-reduced it just so it doesn't get too dark too quickly. And by over-reduced, I mean about 1:1, 1 part paint to 1 part distilled water. And you can see what I'm doing is just kind of spraying a small amount of it over the base of the eyelashes and then just a bit into the corner of the eye. I want to lighten up the right side of the sclera next to the iris, so I'm using that pink eraser, the softer one, and just lightly erasing some paint here. As long as I use a pretty soft amount of pressure, I can pull out an even amount of paint that doesn't have too much texture in it. And so now in order to finish this one up, I'm switching over to the lightest color mixture. That's the number 1 gray mixture from last week's video. And I'm using a ripped piece of paper here just to spray in a few of these wrinkles just below the eyelid. After I have those in, I'll just add a subtle texture with the airbrush freehand, just kind of shaking it around as I paint in. And then what I'll do here is use a curve from one of my shields and just line this up with that lower eyelid, the transition between that and the eye just above it. And you can see what I'm doing here, just erasing into this area using a good amount of pressure on this eraser. This is also the more aggressive eraser, so it's going to help pull out some more paint. And so after making a few passes over the top of this, you can see that when I remove this shield, we just get a very thin highlight, a thin band of light right underneath the eye. And that's just going to help to make the eye look wet, like there's a very subtle reflection down there. I'll add some more paint into the skin texture underneath the eye, and then I'll use my eraser to pull out some highlights right underneath each one of these shadows. And then just like I'm always doing, I'm going back to the airbrush, adding in some more paint, kind of glazing it over the top just to kind of knock down some of the highlights. And now to draw in some of the eyelashes on this lower eyelid, you'll see me using a shield here. Just a part of it that has a curve, I'll draw over it. It'll just help me get in a sharp line. And for the rest of the eyelashes, mostly I'm going to be doing this freehand, just drawing them in. If I need one to be a little bit sharper or the curve is difficult to draw, you'll see me using that shield. But with some patience and control, you should have no problem drawing these in with a pencil, just doing it freehand. And then once these are drawn in, I'll just add a little bit more of some darker paint, the number 2 gray mixture at the bottom, just to make it look like there's a shadow underneath that lower eyelid. And that's basically it. It's a simple little painting. It's something that anyone can do. It's all about being patient and just taking your time with it. And this is what the study looks like complete. You can see it here next to the photo reference just to get a comparison between the two. So that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you just keep on painting and do the best you can to have fun. Enjoy that process. But like always, before I go, I do want to say thank you so much to the generous support of the channel members. I'd like to give a shout out and a welcome to Patrick, Bud, and Joby for joining this week. Thank you so much, guys. I'd also like to thank you, Matt and Dolan at Tier 2 and Tier 3. That's really generous of you guys, so thank you so much for joining. And of course, thank you so much to the incredibly generous support of the current channel members scrolling up on the screen right now. You guys are the best. I can never thank you enough for all of your support. It really means the world to me, so thank you. And as always, I will see you guys back here next Friday. Take care, everyone. Be well.